Elephants are curious animals and they like good food, right? So some of those animals started wandering outside the park, crossing the river, and discovering that there's a lot of really good stuff to eat over there. Like a lot of other parts of Africa, crop raiding became a really big deal. So you had the park celebrating the success of the elephant recovery, and you had the subsistence farmers saying, hey, these are your elephants. They're ruining our livelihoods, and if you don't do something about it, we will.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Vandal Theory, a podcast about science and research at University of Idaho. My name is Lee Cooper, and I will be your host for today. I'm a science writer and editor here at University of Idaho, and I am joined by my wonderful co-host, Danae. How you doing?
I'm pretty good. How are you, Lee?
Not too bad.
I'm Danae Lenz. I am the External Communications Coordinator for U of I.
So today we get to have a little fun. We get to talk about African animals. So to start, Danae, do you have a favorite African animal?
I think I would have to go with the leopard because it's so elusive and it only comes out at night. And every time I watch a travel show based in Africa, people are hanging out in tree houses and stuff in the middle of the night hoping to catch a glimpse of leopards. And I just think that's so fascinating. And also I love cats.
See, I think I have to go on the goofy end. I love a giraffe. They're ridiculous from their very large, weird, crazy purple tongue all the way down to those hooves that are very so far away. They're just weird and gangly, and I adore them. All right. So today we're going to meet Ryan Long, an associate professor of wildlife sciences in the Department of Fish and Wildlife Sciences at University of Idaho. Now, you may remember the Disney's Lion King, where all of the animals from the area show up to honor Simba's birth. Now, obviously that's fictional, but lots of large animals do live alongside each other in Africa, and Long is working to understand how that works and how those animals interact with humans. Ready to go, Danae?
Let's go on safari.
Ryan, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure. Thanks for giving me the opportunity.
So before we jump in, can you tell us just a little bit about your work?
Yeah, so as you just pointed out, Lee, my name is Ryan Long. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Fish and Wildlife Sciences here at the U of I, and I am a large mammal ecologist. So the work that I do focuses on large-bodied animals like deer and elk and moose and elephants and things like that in various parts of the world.
What drew you to large animals to begin with?
Yeah, so the origins of my interest in large mammals are sort of utilitarian in nature to some degree. So when I was young, I grew up in what used to be a relatively rural part of Central Oregon. And my family, I did a lot of hunting and fishing and backpacking with my dad. And so we weren't particularly good at it at the time, but we attempted to use that as a way of putting meat on our table. As I got older, I developed sort of a greater interest in understanding more about how they worked. So I wanted to know why they behave the way they do, why their populations go up and down. What's the biology or the ecology of these animals that underpins the harvest regulations that we're following in the first place? And that's what led me into my career as a wildlife biologist.
And I know you still do more local animals. I know you've got some bighorn sheep projects going. But a bunch of your work has actually been focused in Africa. So what drew you there?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think like probably a lot of people who do the kind of work that I do, that study large mammals, Africa is something that we all dream about, right?
The Holy
Africa,
Grail.
exactly. Everybody who works with large mammals wants to work in Africa, and there's various reasons for that. But I think the biggest is probably just that Africa supports the largest, most diverse populations and communities of large mammals anywhere on the planet. So you can drive around for a couple hours in some of the national parks in Africa, and you can see more species than occur in the entire North American continent.
So we're going to talk about 3 studies that you've done in and around Gorongosa National Park. Can you just give us a quick background? Because it has a relatively unique history of where it is and its background.
Yeah, so Gorongosa National Park, where my African part of my research program is focused, it's located in central Mozambique. So Mozambique was a Portuguese colony up until the early 1970s. They fought a war for their independence and eventually were successful and gained their independence from Portugal. But unfortunately, immediately after winning that war, the two rival political parties in the country entered into a civil war, fought one another. And that civil war, it was long and it was bloody, lasted into the early 90s. More than 1 million people lost their lives. But for purposes of our discussion today, Gorongosa was sort of the geographic center of the conflict. So a lot of the fighting played out in that national park. And as a result, you had a park that went from something that rivaled Serengeti prior
Hmm.
to the war. So you had just unbelievable communities of large animals, thousands of buffalo and wildebeest and zebra and both species of rhino and a whole complement of large carnivores, lions and hyenas and African wild dogs and leopards. You had all of those things there. And the war, poaching primarily for bushmeat and for the sale of various body parts and things to purchase arms and ammunition led to the extirpation of more than 90% of the park's animals. And it left the park a fairly desolate place after the war. And since that time, a lot of the park's wildlife have recovered as a combination of natural recolonization from populations surrounding the park, but also through the efforts of the Gorongosa Restoration Project, which is a nonprofit organization centered in the U.S. That was initiated by an Idahoan by the name of Greg Carr.
So let's dive into your science now.
All right.
The first project really looks at these animals from a very high level. It studies a lot of the basic assumptions and understandings we have about how animals share space in an ecosystem. So, what are some of those assumptions that, at least at first glance, this population appears to break?
Yeah, so, a lot of the field of ecology developed around basic models of various processes like predation and competition. And one of the principles that came out of some of those early ecological models was this idea of competitive exclusions. So, when you've got two species that are trying to use the same space or utilizing the same resources, things along those lines, those species shouldn't be able to coexist under a lot of different conditions. So, a lot of the time in that scenario, one species is eventually going to outcompete the other, and the subordinate competitor is going to go extinct. And yet, in places like Africa, we see these incredibly diverse assemblages of large herbivores that are sharing space, that are sharing habitat, and there's dozens of species, and somehow they are managing to coexist. And so for decades now, there's been a huge amount of interest in understanding the mechanisms that make that possible. And so a lot of our work has revolved around trying to understand those mechanisms.
I think you guys focused on antelope, right?
Yeah, spiral horn antelope in particular.
So tell me about them. What are some of the things you were looking at? What are some of the things you found out?
Yeah, so in terms of trying to understand patterns of coexistence, our focus was really on body size as a mechanism that leads to coexistence. And so we sort of had this suspicion that was grounded in previous work, among other things, that in a nutshell, large animals do things differently than small animals. And that might allow species of different body sizes to coexist. And so we use this spiral horn antelope system as a way of testing a bunch of different hypotheses along those lines. It's a really cool system because in Gorongosa, like in other places in sub-Saharan Africa, you have 4 species of spiral horn antelopes. So you have bushbuck, which are about 60 pounds or so, we'll say. You've got Nyala, which are about the size of a mule deer. You've got kudu, which are about the size of an elk. And then you have eland, which are about the size of a real big Holstein cow. So you've got this huge range of body sizes, but all 4 of those species are in the same genus, which means that they're very closely related. And that helps with a lot of things, right? So if you're interested in the effects of body size, why not just compare a mouse to an elephant or, something along those
Hmm.
lines? And the problem with that kind of comparison is there's so many other differences between those two species besides body size that it becomes almost impossible to attribute your results to body size alone. So by working with this spiral horn system and these 4 species that are very closely related, we can sort of control for a lot of those other differences and just focus on the effects of body size on various components of the ecology of these species, diet and movements and habitat selection and predator responses and things along those lines.
So, what is one of the things that you found out studying this population?
Yeah, so maybe one of the coolest results right off the bat that we got a feel for early on was that despite the fact that these species, especially the first three, bushbuck, Nial, and kudu, despite the fact that they use the same space at the same time, so we've got pictures of these three antelope species standing on the same little patch of habitat, within 10 feet of each other. Despite that, their diets are almost completely non-overlapping. So they
Hmm.
are using those same habitats, but they're eating completely different plant species, or at least very different proportions of the same plant species. And that's one of the things that allows them to coexist. So they've managed to partition their diets, and that's very strongly rooted in body size variation. So small bodied animals need smaller amounts of food, but it has to be higher quality. That's sort of a universal rule we find in the world of wildlife. And larger bodied species, they need a lot more food, but they can subsist on a much lower quality diet. And that principle is what allowed these species to sort of partition their niches or partition their forage resources along that sort of dietary axis and coexist.
I feel like this would have helped my sister and I if we hadn't both liked SpaghettiOs for after school snacks. Life would have been better. We would have more comfortably shared space if she was a tomato soup girl and
Yeah.
I was a SpaghettiOs girl.
Yeah, as a parent, that metaphor definitely resonates. I love it if my two kids were keen on very different snacks or favorite dinners or things like that.
So you found quite a few other things with this group of antelope. What else have you found?
Yeah, well, I mean, we've done various studies over the years with these species, some of which have produced results that we expected. So, for example, the smaller bodied species, as a result of their dietary preferences, select higher quality foraging habitats, whereas the larger bodied species use a wider diversity of habitats. But some of the things we've found have been less expected and more a result of components of this system that tie back to its history in the Civil War. So, for example, the smallest of these species, bushbuck, they're called bushbuck for a reason. So they're this real skittish species that's very strongly tied to woody cover, and they rarely venture far from thick brush. And the reason for that is because they're super vulnerable to pretty much everything with teeth. There's very few predators that don't eat bushbuck, and so you don't see them very often outside of that thick cover.
A little harder to go after an eland.
Yeah, exactly. Eland are huge. And so very few predators that can successfully take down an eland, but bushbuck are like ice cream for pretty much anything. But again, the Civil War resulted in Gorongosa losing almost the entirety of its predator community. So after the war, all the wild dogs, all the leopards, all the hyena, they were all extirpated. The only thing left was a very small number of lions. So, one of the things that we noticed while we were driving around working on this project was we started seeing bushbuck out in these open floodplain grassland type habitats. So these are habitats that are like, you can envision them as like a lawn or a park. They're short grass kind of habitats that have a lot of really high quality, really green food available, but absolutely no cover. You can see animals from miles away in these habitats. And it struck us as really strange to see bushbuck out in these habitats. And so we decided to try to figure out what was going on with that. We did this big unplanned study that involved a bunch of experimental manipulation. We put some GPS collars out on bushbuck in both different habitat types, and we measured their condition and their body mass. We did some predator playback experiments to see whether we could reinstill fear in these animals. And then we did some herbivore exclusion experiments out in this floodplain habitats to see if bushbuck moving out into that habitat had any effect on the plant community. And we learned that the extirpation of bushbuck predators in the park had this whole cascading effect on other things. So, first of all, it released bushbuck from fear of predation. And so those individuals that were bolder moved out into the floodplain and immediately benefited from it. They grew, they were larger, had more fat, larger body mass, they were more successful. And that was because they were eating these very specific plant species in the floodplain. And it turns out that they were eating plant species that other grazers that are out there, bushbuck are not grazers, they're browsers, so you don't normally find them in these grasslands. They weren't eating the same plants. And so by moving onto the floodplain, they also had an effect on the plant community in the floodplain. Yeah, it was this whole like cascade of different effects that was all triggered by the extirpation of predators.
That's amazing. It's so interesting to me in nature. You always see these like one domino goes over and then it's like, oh man, now we got to track the whole thing.
Exactly. Exactly.
So, speaking of observing something unique in the Gorongosa area, you guys noticed something interesting about the Gorongosa elephants. What was that?
Yeah, so immediately when we started working in the park, we noticed that a large number of the female elephants there didn't have tusks, which are sort of a defining feature of elephants, right?
Even the smallest child
Yeah,
puts tusks on their elephants that they're drawing.
exactly. Exactly. And that struck us kind of like the bushbuck thing. It struck us as odd. And so we began to wonder about like, okay, what are the causes of that? And also, what are the potential consequences of it? And so we sort of initiated this project to understand whether or not the high frequency of tusklessness in among female elephants in the park was a result of the Civil War. The prior to the war, in that was centered geographically on Gorongosa, there was about 2,500 elephants in the park, and these are rough estimates, but somewhere around 15 to 20% of those elephants, the female elephants only, not the males. We'll talk about that in a minute. Were tuskless, and in other parts of Africa, there's always this sort of low background level of tusklessness in females. It usually runs about 4 to 6% or so. But in Gorongosa, we were seeing a whole lot more tuskless females than that, and it turned out that about half of the remaining population after the war was tuskless. So the population went from about 2,500 animals prior to the war to about 200 animals after the war. And the reason for that was the poaching of elephants to sell ivory, purchase arms and ammunition. And tusks are not just a defining feature of elephants from a child's perspective, but they serve a function, right? They've evolved for a reason. Elephants have tusks because they use them.
Mhm.
They use them to forage, to strip bark from trees, to push over trees, to get at the leaves and things that are higher up. They play a role in social interactions. They use them to dig for water, all kinds of things like that, right? So natural selection has favored elephants having tusks. Well, during the war, we suspected that tusks may have become a liability and that the war itself, the intensive poaching pressure that elephants experience, might have actually reversed the process of evolution. And so we set out to understand whether that was the case. We did some initial sampling. We went out and we collected genetic samples from a bunch of female elephants that had tusks and a bunch of female elephants that didn't have tusks. And we did some genomic analyses that allowed us to identify a couple of genes that were specifically responsible for tusk growth, and that mutations of which can lead to the absence of tusks.
Okay.
And of course, being heritable, having a genetic basis, is a prerequisite for evolution by natural selection. We were able to document that it was intensive poaching pressure selecting for these mutant genes that resulted in the lack of tusks that increased the proportion of tusklessness in the Gorongosa elephant population following the war. So you essentially had rapid human-induced evolution of tusklessness in this population.
That's so fast, especially for such a long-lived species where long-lived species, it takes you only have one little elephant each time. It takes so long for an evolutionary change to occur with big critters usually.
Yeah.
But that's so fast. That's a couple decades.
Absolutely. It's super fast. And of course, the time frame for evolutionary change like that is driven in part by the strength of the selective pressure that's being imposed, right? So in a normal situation, there might be a little bit of a selective pressure. It could take decades or centuries or even longer, right? But the poaching pressure was extremely intense, right? So during this 16-year period, you went from 2,500 elephants to 200 elephants. And so it was the intensity of that selection against the genes that confer tusks, right, that lead to tusk growth, that produced the sort of rapidity of the evolution of tusklessness in this population.
So through this little part of the conversation, you've been teasing that it's just the females. What happened to the males?
Yeah, crazy, right? So that
Mhm.
was another thing that we did not expect, that we learned from this study, was like we never saw a single tuskless male. And if you look back through all the published literature that you can find from other parts of Africa, the best you can do is to find the occasional anecdotal account of a tuskless male. And, whether or not those are real is questionable. So we always wondered why that's the case. And I had my suspicions about the reasons, and it turned out that I was completely wrong. So I gave interviews like this in the beginning of that project where I was like, oh, well, I think it's probably because there's stronger selection for tusk growth in males because they use their tusks for combat, to gain access to breeding rights to females. And so, those mutant genes that confer tusklessness have probably been weeded out of the male population. Completely wrong. Completely wrong. It turns out that the genes that lead to tusk growth are X-linked. They occur on the X chromosome. More important than that, though, is they are male lethal. So females have two X chromosomes. They get one from their mother and one from their father. But males also have an X chromosome that they inherit from their mother. And these mutants do, that male offspring dies. And that's why we don't have tuskless males, because they can't survive. So yeah, kind of an unexpected discovery in the course of that project.
Oh, that's amazing. It's such an elegant answer to what your observations were. So before we go, I have one more elephant study I want to talk about with you.
Okay.
And it has to do with the fact that the elephants are actually doing better now, which on the surface, yay. But that does bring some complications to the table.
It does.
What were you seeing happen? What was happening on the ground?
As you sort of alluded to from the park's perspective, from a conservation perspective, the gradual recovery of the elephant population following the war has been a good thing. But one of the things that happened during the absence of the majority of the elephant population in the immediate aftermath of the war was that subsistence farming communities developed along the boundaries of the park, and the southern boundary in particular. And so you had people sort of setting up these subsistence farms right up against the edge of the river that forms the southern boundary of the park. And it's important to keep in mind that we're not talking about massive commercial operations that can sort of afford to take a bit of a hit. We're talking about small family farms that where people were just growing enough food to support their family through the year. And as the elephant population increased, the park started having elephants are curious animals and they like good food, right? So some of those animals started wandering outside the park, crossing the river, and discovering that there's a lot of really good stuff to eat over there. Like a lot of other parts of Africa, crop raiding became a really big deal. So you had the park celebrating the success of the elephant recovery, and you had the subsistence farmers saying, hey, these are your elephants. They're ruining our livelihoods, and if you don't do something about it, we will. When I first started working in Gorongosa, one of the park vets came to me and said, hey, would you be interested in conducting a study to sort of better understand the crop raiding problem and trying to figure out what the best solution to that problem might be? So I said, yeah, absolutely. And I had just started at U of I. And so I used some of my startup funds to get that project going. And there was two parts to it. So the first part, we just wanted to better understand the nature of the problem, the whens and the wheres, and was there certain times a year when crop raiding was more frequent? Was there certain crops that the raiding animals were focused on? Was there specific locations that they were using to cross the river? Things along those lines. So we went out and we darted a handful of crop raiding male elephants. Males, unfortunately, are the primary offenders. And we tracked their movements for a couple of years, and we learned a lot. We learned a lot about when they do the most raiding and things like that. But potentially the most important thing we learned was that they can't just cross the river anywhere. There were specific locations that were shallow enough and accessible enough that those were the key crossing points. And we used that information for the second part of the project, which was to experimentally test a variety of different community-based strategies for keeping elephants in the park. And, if you ask somebody like, well, what's the easiest way to keep an animal from going from one place to another? The most intuitive answer is a fence.
Although I could see fence plus elephant having some issues, because now I'm picturing like fences in Jurassic Park level of fencing.
Right. That's exactly right. So the kind of fence that's necessary to effectively keep elephants from moving is like Jurassic Park level, like big and lots of electricity. And that's just not something that was maintainable, park like this over, miles of this river boundary. And so what we needed was something that the communities themselves could help keep up and that they were vested in. So my graduate student on that project, Paula Branco, she went to different parts of Africa and got trained how to implement several of these community-based strategies. One was beehive fencing. So it turns out that elephants, as big and massive as they are, they're sensitive around the ears and the trunk and to bee stings. They don't like bees, and African honeybees are super aggressive. And so you can build these fences out of beehives that are essentially like you have hives that are hanging and they're connected. So they can swing. They're connected with baling twine and nothing more. An elephant could just walk through it if it wanted. But elephants are super curious, so they don't walk through things. They mess with them. So they'll walk up to them and they'll grab them with their trunks and they'll manipulate them, and that shakes the hives and the bees get irritated and swarm. So that was one technique we tried. And then she also went to Tanzania and learned how to construct chili fences. So elephants don't like spicy food, apparently. So you can dry and grind these super spicy chilies, and you can mix them in with oil and soak rags in this oil and lay out these rags along a twine fence. And elephants will mess with those, and the idea is that they'll be put off by that. So we tried that. We tried combining the beehives and the chili fences, and then we had some control fences that looked like beehives or looked like chili fences, but didn't actually have the mechanism.
So which worked?
Yeah, what we learned was that by far, the most effective of those different strategies was the beehive fences. So beehive fences reduced elephant crossings from the park to the farming community by over 90%, which was super cool.
That's
Reduced
a
the crop
solid
rating.
result.
It is. And it also had this side benefit of honey production. So honey is a valuable commodity. So the communities were vested in it, not just because of the crop rating reduction, but because they could also market the honey. When we got those results, and this is one of the coolest sort of applications of the work that I've done in Gorongosa, they took the results of our small scale experiment. We had just blocked off about a dozen or so of these crossing points, and they invested in it and they upscaled it. They developed the Gorongosa honey program. They bought more than 100 hives and worked closely with the community to produce these beehive fences along a much larger stretch of the park boundary along the southern edge there. And that has helped, not eliminate it, but it has helped mediate this conflict between the park and the local farming communities.
Well, Ryan, we're at the end here. Any last thoughts to leave with our listeners?
Yeah, I think one of the things that struck me as I've talked through these different projects that I've worked on is just the importance of not losing that initial fascination with nature that leads to a lot of us wanting to be scientists in the first place, right? That's where a lot of us get our start. We're like, oh, why does this work this way? Or, how is that happening? And all these sort of cool things about nature. But a lot of us, as we get into our careers, we get bogged down in publication and data analysis and the stresses of being a scientist, and we forget that part, and we sort of lose that fascination. And some of the work that I've shared today, the bushbuck project and the elephant tuskless project, those projects all stem not from some deep review of the literature or something, but instead they stemmed from just being observant of the world around us as we were driving around in the park looking at things. Yeah, I'd encourage people to, especially the folks that are interested in this kind of thing, to never quit being observant.
An excellent thing to leave people with. Well, thank you so much, Ryan.
You bet. Thanks for having me.
All right, Danae. So, what do you think about that one?
This interview was so fascinating. Everything about the elephants was just so cool. But the thing I couldn't get out of my head was elephants not liking bees. The mental picture is very cute, and it's kind of hilarious because these things are huge and they're like afraid of these tiny little insects. It seems like an Aesop's fable almost. The elephant and the bee. I don't know what the moral would be, but anyway, it's just great. All these innovative ideas for keeping these massive elephants out is great. And, the fact that they came up with more than one idea other than just a fence is really cool.
For me, I was so intrigued by the elephant tusk story because we talk about humans causing evolution to happen, especially when we're talking about like farming and things, and we're selecting for better crops and for bigger cattle. But this is a wonderful example of unintended consequences, and that, humans can nudge evolution across the board.
Yeah, my jaw was on the floor during that part of the interview.
All right, everyone. Well, thank you so much for listening today. You can visit our website, uidaho.edu/Vandal Theory, for more information about all of our research. Email us at vandaltheory@uidaho.edu. We're out there on all of the podcasting platforms, so come see us and rate and review and subscribe. My name is Lee Cooper.
And I'm Danae Lenz.
Thanks for listening.